Stop Russia, stop the war.
Stop Russia, stop the war.
Help Ukraine, protect peace.
Help Ukraine protect peace.
Help Ukraine, protect peace.
Help Ukraine protect peace.
Help Ukraine, protect peace.
Help Ukraine protect peace.
The shift of this paradigm, the turning of the tide right now is very good news, my friends. Because although in the past France and Germany had been dragging their feet quite a lot in terms of aid for Ukraine, military aid especially, now at least France is starting to wake up to the necessity of facing the Russian terrorist regime head on. Because we cannot negotiate with those who refuse to negotiate. We cannot negotiate with a country that breaks the treaties as soon as they are made, as the Russian terrorist regime has done so many times in the past and continues to do as we speak. At the war in Donbass and at the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russian terrorist regime continued their antics of breaking their word as soon as it is made. Because they have made that word for one purpose only: to make sure that the Ukrainians and the free world lower their guard and can be attacked with a sneak attack, with a sucker punch, with a backstab. That is how the Russian terrorist regime behaves. That's the only way they know how to behave. And that's exactly why the Russian terrorist regime needs to fall. There needs to be a new Russia, a reformed country, or perhaps many countries, instead of this imperialistic and genocidal regime that wants to be similar to the Soviet Union that it romanticizes so much. Because Putin has said so himself many times in the past, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. Quite an unheard thing to say for any leader in Europe. Imagine that the German Chancellor started complaining about the fall of Nazi Germany. That would have been frowned upon, and rightfully so. But why is it that when Putin romanticizes with the even more genocidal Soviet Union, people take it at face value and say, oh, you know, it's just their history? Well, my friends, there is some history that people should be proud of, and some history people should not be proud of. So that we know what were the mistakes, so that we know where was the genocide, and what can be avoided for the future. That is the only way for us to move into a better future. A freer future. A future of trade and diplomacy. And nuclear demilitarization. Not of nuclear saber rattling and genocide, like that Russia threatens every single time things don't go as they please, which by default is every single time. But my friends, this is not the only bit of news that we have. Everybody has heard about the Moscow terror attack that 4 jihadis have perpetrated against the whole crowd in Moscow. We condemn this terror attack. We condemn any act of terrorism by any terrorist organization in the world. Terrorist organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, ISIS, and of course, ISIS Khorasan, also known as ISIS-K, which is the terrorist group that took full responsibility for this terror attack in Moscow. We condemn them unequivocally. However, my friends, we also condemn the Russian terrorist regime. And it has been proven already that there is a very high likelihood that this was an inside job by the FSB. That's right, my friends. Anybody who knows Litvinenko, the ex-FSB agent who fled to the United Kingdom and who was poisoned here by the Russian terrorist regime, if we hear his messages, if we heed his calls, if we listen to what he used to be saying, that we know that the FSB attacks the Russian people themselves to whip them up into a frenzy and to send them in meat waves against anyone who the Russian terrorist regime claims are their enemies. Of course, the Russian terrorist regime does not care about their own people. They are more than happy to slaughter their people like lambs by the hundreds. But you don't have to take our word for it. We can look at the evidence. For example, we can look at the fact that these 4 men were brought all the way from Tajikistan. 4 men that were allowed to go into one of the most important event spots in Moscow, unopposed and fully armed with automatic weapons. They were allowed to slaughter more than 100 Russians. And then, only then, hours after they had already made their escape in a little car, only then were they caught by the FSB much further away from Moscow, supposedly on the way to Ukraine. The Russian terrorist regime, in their usual style, claimed that the Ukrainians had caused this somehow. And they were even claiming that the Ukrainians were making plans to let them escape into Ukraine. Now that is the most ridiculous statement, my friends. I'd like to dissect it properly. How were the Ukrainians supposed to give these individuals an escape route if there is literally a front line between Russia and Ukraine? A completely mined, shelled and bombed no man's land in the middle. Defended trenches, frontiers. How is the Russian terrorist regime expecting people to believe that these terrorists were planning to escape Russia and go through not 1 but 2 front lines? One, the Russian front, and the other, the front of the Ukrainians facing against the Russians. And also, as mentioned, the mined no man's land in the middle. How would that be possible? How were the Ukrainians supposed to give them an escape route? Absolutely ridiculous. Idiotic. Only complete fools would believe in the Russian terrorist regime and in these little bouts that they have. In this finger-pointing rhetoric. Oh, he did it. He did it. This kind of witch hunt ideology. It's meaningless, my friends. We need to see reality as it is. And the reality is that these individuals were paid in Russian rubles that were sent to them to a Russian bank card. And now we beg the question, who might have paid them in Russian rubles? Who has hired these individuals?
Russians.
Thank you, Tony. The quiet part out loud, as people say. But it is necessary to say this. It seems very clear now that it was the Russian FSB that hired these terrorists to slaughter Russian citizens and to make sure that they would have a cheap excuse to do a full mobilization of the Russian population and throw them like meat against the Ukrainian people who are fighting for their freedom. And the same has happened in the past. As we mentioned, Litvinenko, the individual, the ex-FSB agent who has revealed what the FSB was doing before the Chechen wars. There was one particularly spicy event that Litvinenko has revealed, where the FSB had mined a whole building full of Russian civilians and were getting ready to blow it to smithereens. But then, by pure occasion, pure accident, the people who lived there found the bombs and they called the police. They thought it was about to be a terror attack. But they noticed that the technology was very, very high-tech. A bit too high-tech for the Chechens, you might say. Patrushev, the leader of the FSB, ran from the building where he was working and immediately started making calls, screaming and shouting, "No! Those are not real explosives. That's just sugar. Sugar packages, flour packages. We were just doing some training exercises. And as clockwork, the FSB, of course, had to send their agents and remove all of these explosives from there. Very interesting. Because at around that time, there were plenty of explosions all over Russia. And they always blamed the Chechens of doing that. Their enemies at that time. And now that Ukraine is defending itself against them, against their genocidal antics, now they point finger at the Ukrainians. When they are hurting themselves, when they are doing inside jobs in their country and slaughtering their people by the hundreds, just so they can send their people to die by the hundreds of thousands in Ukraine. Because as we know, in some particular battles, like Bakhmut and Avdiivka, the casualty rate is absolutely atrocious for the Russian regime. 5 to 1, 6 to 1, 8 to 1, 10 to 1. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to Putin if 10 Russians die for each Ukrainian. Because for him, life is cheap. And that's exactly why we need to stand together to stop the Russian terrorist regime and to show the world that it's time to wake up so that they don't die in their sleep. World, wake up!
World, wake up!
World, wake up!